Matron felled by cane in old plantation setting. That arresting headline from 1963 talks about the crime that Bob Dylan's song The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll is about. He recorded the song in October of 1963, so the same year that the incident happened. It was in February of that year. This is a great song. It's a major song about a minor event. By minor, what I mean is that's how it was treated, right? This was not the death of Emmett Till or Medgar Evers. Both those were much bigger news stories, and I mean, for legitimate reasons. But that headline that I showed you at the start of the video was from an African-American paper. Hattie Carroll's death was more of a passing news story and not front-page headline material. The tragedy occurred in Maryland, and even Maryland papers covered it as more of a quick curiosity. And, she was not a civil rights leader like Edgar's, and she didn't die in as gruesome of a fashion, anything close to it, as Till. Her death was more accidental, but there is still just tremendous heartbreak in the story. And that's one of the two things that really make this song stand out. One is the use of language, and we'll get to that. It's as good as Dylan's ever done. And two, though, what he really latches onto is every death and every injustice that comes from systemic racism is a tragedy, even when the particulars of the incident don't make it a perfect case sample to use. Let's get to the particulars. February 8th, Baltimore, Maryland, at the hotel illustrated here, the swanky Hotel Emerson, there was a spinster's ball, a formal charity event that William Zenzinger and his wife showed up to. Hattie Carroll, 51 years old, mother of 11, was working the late-night event, along with other African Americans, when Zenzinger and his wife arrived. They were both boorish. He was definitely drunk and boorish. She was arrested for disorderly conduct and then just failed to appear in court when her time came. Meanwhile, though, he had kind of a novelty cane with him, but a cane nonetheless. Here it is, and you will not see this in most articles about the song or crime. I don't know why so many sources make a big deal out of the cane not being like a quote-unquote real cane. I mean, it looks real enough to me. And he struck 3 different employees with it, all black. What a surprise. During the evening, 1 man, 2 women. One of those women was, of course, Hattie Carroll, who died the next day in the hospital. It turns out he pretty much killed her with his words as much as with his actions. He wanted a drink. She wasn't making it fast enough for his liking. And he said, "I want it now, you black bee." And when she said she was going as fast as she could, he said, "I don't have to take that kind of blank off of a N." He was a large young man, as you can see. He hit her with the cane. The hospital found no injury related to that, meaning, broken bone or a bruise, but he did strike her with it. And when it was over, her last words were, "I just feel so ill. The man has upset me so." She collapsed and died later at the hospital, as we mentioned. So basically, she died of an aneurysm. The medical examiner said she had an enlarged heart and hardened arteries. Zenzinger, showing infinite compassion, said, quote, "From what the doctors testified, she probably would have been dead next morning anyway," end quote. For the life of me, I'll never understand why most accounts, even those in left-leaning sources, go to pains to kind of modulate the view of him in various ways. No, he was a piece of garbage. He was completely unrepentant. He joked about how his very short jail sentence, which was delayed by the judge so that he could work the season on his 600-acre farm, would just allow him to ride out bad weather. Quote, "I'll just miss a lot of snow," he said with a grin, "and I'll be back in time for the spring harvest," end quote. And it'd be nice if people writing on the song, or at the time of his death, or on the anniversary of the tragedy, etc., actually managed to find those kind of quotes, because I did. Seriously, that last quotation, pretty startling one, I've never seen that in one article about the song or incident. Here's an illustration from the trial, by the way. Ironically, he was sentenced on the same day as the March on Washington. So that's what happens while Dylan is there at the march with MLK and everybody else. And it's said he read about the conviction on his way back to New York. So just imagine from a songwriter's perspective, you've just gotten back from seeing Martin Luther King speak and seeing 200,000 protesters, marching for civil rights, and then reading about a rich white landowner killing a 51-year-old woman and getting a deferred 6-month sentence. The lack of real justice due to race and economics definitely stood out to Dylan. This is a white tie and tail affair, very formal, and at it, people like Hattie Carroll of the minority have to serve people like William Zenzinger, who can be as drunk and abusive as they want, and nobody does anything about it. As far as I could ascertain, this is the actual ballroom. But back to the sentence, that was the real kicker for Bob Dylan. America's two-tiered system of justice and its hollow promise of equality under the law. That's what Dylan chooses to go after in this song, much more so than Zenzinger himself. And this is something we've seen before, even on this album. This brilliant way of highlighting, here is the bigger problem, people. Here is the root cause. Obviously something we saw with Only a Pawn in Their Game. You can't read about this song without reading about how it gets some of the facts wrong, which it does. He misspells Zenzinger's name by leaving the T out, so that's why it's William Zenzinger. It says Hattie Carroll had 10 children when she had 11. These were mistakes that were in print in some of the newspaper articles at the time, so it's really not that surprising that they made it into Dylan's song. You can easily picture him reading an article about this, getting the inspiration to write a song, and then running with it from there. One interesting loose thread that I found, a real rare one, I'd never heard about this when it comes to the song before, was supposedly some kind of request was made in writing by Dylan or the record company, more likely the record company, to the police department for details. But the writer who talked about this said it was missing from the file, so probably taken as a souvenir by somebody, a Dylan-related souvenir at some point throughout the years. Let's dive into the song itself now, as opposed to the event. 419 words, 47 lines, broken into just 4 stanzas. It runs 5 minutes and 47 seconds on the official audio, so almost 6 minutes. And that 4-part structure that I mentioned is really important because part 1, first stanza, breaks down the crime. Second one focuses on William Zenzinger. Third, on Hattie Carroll. And then the fourth, on the trial. The overall design of the song is a 4-part tragedy. Each of those individual parts is its own tragedy, and that's why it always ends with Dylan saying, basically, don't cry yet, until the end of the 4th part, the very end of the song, and then it's, okay, now you can cry. But remember we said the murder is in the 1st part. He dispenses with that pretty quickly. Part 2 focuses on how awful William Zenzinger is, how privileged and nasty. 3rd part focuses on Hattie Carroll, like we said, and it's, just kind of the sad facts around her life and how undeserving she was of what happened to her. The hypocrisy of the law, the inequality that we talked about, that is what comes last. Like we said, the 4th part is about the trial itself, and kind of that's when you're allowed to cry. Like that is the final insult added to the injury of the murder. And the first stanza is just amazing. William Zenzinger killed poor Hattie Carroll with a cane that he twirled round his diamond ring finger. The first line is simple and direct, but it has more than you think it does in it. It's got the 2 protagonists, of course. Poor Hattie Carroll. If you normally say so-and-so killed poor so-and-so, they are poor because they deserve pity, because they've been killed. And that certainly applies here, but Hattie Carroll is also literally financially poor, which is juxtaposed with twirling a cane around your diamond ring finger. And as Professor Christopher Ricks, who I mention a lot in these videos, focused on, diamond ring finger is a fascinating little thing. It's not a finger that had a diamond ring on it. It's as he's so wealthy, it's as if he's made of diamonds himself. And my own observation, notice the almost nursery rhyme-like quality to that opening couplet. And yes, I'll read it again. William Zenzinger killed poor Hattie Carroll with a cane that he twirled around his diamond ring finger. I think Professor Ricks is correct that Dylan was fascinated by the sounds of these 2 names as well. They're both kind of unusual. And they don't rhyme, but they kind of fit together, and that's why they're stuck together on that first line, which is also a preview of how the song is going to flow, because the very first words of the 2nd stanza, it's William Zenzinger's name. The very first words of the 3rd stanza, it's Hattie Carroll's name. Skip ahead, the stanza moves on to the fact that he is booked for the crime, and then here's what we were talking about earlier. But you who philosophize disgrace and criticize all fears, take the rag away from your face. Now ain't the time for your tears. That's how the first 3 stanzas end, is with those 3 lines. So it's obviously really important. The point he's trying to drive home here is, 1, things are going to get even worse than you think. And, at least in my opinion, what I said earlier, that this is a succession of tragedies. The act was a tragedy, the murder. William Zenzinger, just that kind of a product of entitlement and protected racism, his existence, that there are people like that, that's a tragedy. Hattie Carroll, that somebody like that has to be poor and work themselves near to death to support her children, that's a tragedy. Here's Zenzinger, technically Zenzinger's business card. Let's go through real quick the description of him. William Zenzinger, who at 24 years owns a tobacco farm of 600 acres, with rich, wealthy parents who provide and protect him, and high office relations in the politics of Maryland, reacted to his deed with a shrug of his shoulders, and swear words and sneering, and his tongue it was snarling. In a matter of minutes, on bail was out walking. And it may just be me, and certainly I've never seen anyone else make this observation, but doesn't that seem to have that childlike sing-song nursery rhyme quality to it? And that, in combination with Dylan's really gentle singing on this one, it's almost languid, combines to make for a real unique sound. He's covered this kind of ground before, of course, and he will again in his career, but this is a unique sounding and feeling song. Some of the repetition of sound technique that we talk about so much in these videos, parents who provide and protect him, right? So parents provide, protect. Swear words and sneering, and his tongue it was snarling. Swear, sneering, snarling. The line actually also has words, his, and was, so it just really crams in that S sound. The line about high office relations in the politics of Maryland, that's one of the factual errors that gets called out. But Dylan was correct. Zenzinger's father was a member of the State Planning Commission in Maryland, and no doubt that's the detail that showed up somewhere that Dylan thought about when he wrote that line. So once again, congratulations, lazy writers and researchers. I found that detail. You should have been able to as well. Look at the stark contrast between his life and Hattie Carroll's. Hattie Carroll was a maid of the kitchen. She was 51 years old and gave birth to 10 children, who carried the dishes and took out the garbage, and never sat once at the head of the table, and didn't even talk to the people at the table, who just cleaned up all the food from the table and emptied the ashtrays on a whole other level. One notable feature there, of course, is the fact that 3 different lines in a row end with the word table. Some have criticized that. That's kind of a personal choice. I think on paper that does look bad in any song or, poem, but the point here, I believe, and I do think it's effective, is to touch upon the drudgery of her work, the incredibly joyless and repetitive work of cleaning up after other people. Wonderful little detail with emptied the ashtrays on a whole other level. Why mention ashtrays? Remember, Zenzinger owns a tobacco farm. That's a brilliant touch, and of course it's not force-fed to us, it's not obvious, classic Dylan. Hopefully you'll notice and realize how great this songwriting is. But yeah, think about the money he makes off this cash crop, off of tobacco, and then when it gets used and there's nothing but that refuse left, the dirty ashes, that's when Hattie Carroll gets involved with that same product. The stanza actually continues after that line about the ashtrays. Got killed by a blow, lay slain by a cane, that sailed through the air and came down through the room, doomed and determined to destroy all the gentle, and she never done nothing to William Zenzinger. There's so much great poetry in just those few lines. Got killed by a blow, by a blow. That alone is good, but then you have lay slain by a cane. Just fantastic. And what did that cane do? That sailed through the air and came down through the room. Notice it doesn't come down onto Hattie Carroll, etc., through the room. That's actually an interesting choice. It might just be me, but I think it highlights how this room is a place where she had no rights, where the rich and entitled can get away with abusing someone like her. But the word room serves double duty because it leads to doomed. Room, doomed, right? So you're tying these lines together. It's not just the double O of room and doom. Notice how down through the room, down and room, right? Starting with a D, ending with kind of prepares you for doomed. Down through the room, doomed. And then that next line is great in and of itself. Look at how many times the D sound shows up, not just at the start of words or at the end of words, but both. Doomed, right? It's on both ends. Same thing with determined. Doomed and determined to destroy. That's 6 times when you count the word and. And, that repetition is very aggressive, right? And the words and the sounds, doomed, determined, destroy. So that's representing, what happened to her. And she's represented by this real soft word that has no hard sounds in it like that, gentle. And then the final line in what we're looking at right now, and she never done nothing to William Zenzinger. I think that's purposefully incorrect, right? It's the language of the common people, people like Hattie Carroll. Of course, we get the refrain one more time before the final stanza. We haven't even talked about, I'll just stick to this one point about the refrain, but you who philosophize disgrace and criticize all fears. You who. You can hear Dylan really emphasizes that internal rhyme there, and it's a big kind of propellant in this song. And also, with those words, you, the listener, are being directly addressed throughout the song, which is, I think, an interesting touch. Okay, final stanza now. We've dealt with the event, the two protagonists, and now we're at the courtroom. And just the use of language here is just phenomenal. Listen to how these things kind of work together and roll off the tongue. Not that it's easy to read them out. Trust me, this is not my first attempt to get this part of it down on audio. In the courtroom of honor, the judge pounded his gavel to show that all's equal and that the courts are on the level, and that the strings in the books ain't pulled and persuaded, and that even the nobles get properly handled once that the cops have chased after and caught 'em, and that the ladder of law has no top and no bottom. Stared at the person who killed for no reason, who just happened to be feelin' that way without warnin', and he spoke through his cloak most deep and distinguished, and handed out strongly for penalty and repentance William Zenzinger with a 6-month sentence. I don't know how many times I tried to make it through that, and I had to do 2 different audio segments to get through it successfully. And hopefully, despite the fact that I'm not very good at reciting lyrics or poetry like that, hopefully you still heard what to me is the defining quality of Dylan's songwriting. The words stand completely on their own. Basically, it read as a very good poem in and of itself. And I could spend another 10 minutes, don't worry, I won't, but I could spend another 10 minutes just picking apart this final stanza, just with the words on paper, again, not even counting what he does with sound, elongating certain sounds, taking pauses, etc., the singing portion, and not even worrying about what the song does with the actual music, of course. And back to the words then, we can see what has really rubbed Dylan the wrong way about all of this is the hypocrisy of the court, the courtroom of honor, your honor, the honorable so-and-so. The idea of equal protection under the law. The ladder of law has no top and no bottom. Notice the alliteration, of course, ladder of law. Similar to pulled and persuaded, deep and distinguished. Spoke through his cloak, even feelin' that way without warnin', warnin'. So you can see how this stanza is littered with pairs of sounds, sometimes even more than one per line. That gives it all, to me, this real cumulative building effect, which ironically and purposefully ends with this huge letdown, the slap on the wrist, the 6-month sentence. I really could keep going, but I'm not going to. The final refrain then comes in, and of course it has an important twist. Instead of, but you who philosophize disgrace and criticize our fears, take the rag away from your face, now ain't the time for your tears. Instead it's, oh, but you who philosophize disgrace and criticize all fears, bury the rag deep in your face, for now's the time for your tears. In other words, now you're allowed to cry. Notice a possible play on the word bury, because of course poor Hattie Carroll is going to have to be buried because of what happened to her. And you're allowed to cry now because the full tragedy has unfolded. It's not just the killing, it's the injustice. You're not just mourning Hattie Carroll, you're mourning the real state of justice in the United States. Just for people who are of a different skin color and lower on the economic ladder. Important coda that we have to get to when it comes to all of this. You might remember I showed William Zenzinger's business card earlier in the video. That was kind of a tease, because he got into that game later in life and then got to go to jail for a second time. And unfortunately, the more things change, the more they stay the same. I think he got beneficial treatment for a second time. From the Washington Post. Zenzinger pleaded guilty in November to unfair and deceptive trade practices for illegally collecting more than $60,000 in rent after losing the properties because he failed to pay taxes on them, end quote. So what we're talking about here is he owned properties, rented them out to, no surprise, black residents. These were just really squalid conditions too. And he didn't pay his taxes, lost the property. His residents, his tenants didn't know that, so he kept charging them rent for years. charging poor people for rent on properties you don't own. This was in the 1990s, by the way, and yeah, the man was scum. He was sentenced to 18 months in jail and fined $50,000. That's less than the amount of money he stole from these poor people. He should have had to pay a $50,000 fine and then also, on top of that, pay every cent back to these people he robbed. He was also sentenced to 2,400 hours of community service. And get this, for local groups that advocate low-cost housing, quote from the judge, each can benefit from your expertise and your abilities, end quote. Okay, that seems really complimentary for a slumlord who was stealing money from people. And we all know the jail time was reduced because of the community service. Would an African American who stole cars for 5 years be allowed to get out of jail early so they could go volunteer at garages because they could benefit from his experience? Yeah, no. Then articles always point out how some of his quote-unquote tenants, well, no, actually they weren't his tenants at all. It wasn't his property, but how some of them defended him and said if it wasn't for him, they would have been homeless. As if that's like a character witness for him. No, people who are exploited sometimes don't understand how badly they're being exploited and can even be tricked into sympathizing with the person that's taking advantage of them. Just think of every televangelist ever. To wrap it all up, I'll say Dylan wrote a masterful song and performs masterfully. It's really amazing what he did here. The oft-mentioned Christopher Ricks, Sir Christopher Ricks, excuse me, and I've gotten to meet him, a world-class expert on poetry in the English language, who, of course, loves Dylan. He particularly loves this song. He basically calls it a perfect composition, and his writings on the song in this book pictured here are well worth reading. He gets into a ton of detail that I didn't even touch. So not only did Dylan write a truly great song, but no, I don't think he went too far or was unfair to Zenzinger. He showed his true colors throughout his whole life. To his quote-unquote credit, at least he said this, quote, decades later, quote, "I know that I caused that woman's death," end quote. Yes, you did. Thanks for watching.